What's going on, everybody? Hope you're having a great Saturday. Doing this member stream in the primetime slot. Normally, when I have been able to do regular live streams, I've done them on Saturday afternoons, but didn't have anything prepared for the masses today. Wasn't able to stream last night, so I figured why not do the member stream now on Saturday. Got some questions here in the Discord that I'll hit on, and then take questions from you guys. As always, I want to talk about I want to talk about just on a personal level, one of my best ball teams that I'm sweating about this weekend, and also touch on a couple of small rookie things, 2025 rookie class things. Still haven't dived in too much, but I was listening to Dynasty Points. I don't know how many people in here also follow that podcast. Definitely would recommend it, but I was listening to their show they did with Brett Whitefield. So I want to talk about some of the stuff they touched on and just get into some high level conversations. What's up, Yellow Dog? You're absolutely right. My son is in fact asleep right now, although my wife is very accommodating, and so usually isn't an issue, when I do want to jump on the stream, but it doesn't hurt that he's asleep right now. T-Hum, welcome in. Drop in one of my very few custom pure potential emojis. Really got to work on those. I just haven't really been struck with any particularly inspiring ideas, but it would be fun to have some more that are related to the channel. Might have to get an emoji of one of these, since I always seem to have one when I'm live. Anyway, just in the interest of being selfish, I'm going to start by talking about one of my best ball teams. So apologies if you're not interested in this. You're welcome to skip ahead. I just wanted to talk about it because I drafted a few teams, like 7, I think, in this contest on Underdog called the Eliminator. And this is a contest where basically every week you are in a pod of other drafters. So the first week you play against the people that drafted with you. And then basically a certain percentage of that pod gets cut every week out of the contest. So the first week it's like 10 of the 12 teams survive to the next week. Then you may end up in a group of 10 and 8 out of 10 make it to the next week. And that continues every week, and it starts to get thinner and thinner until you get to the final week in week 17. The last 115 teams battle it out for the top score. So anyway, I drafted 7 of these. Thought it was a fun format. You kind of get to sweat a little bit every week and see if your team survives. Long story short, I have one team that has made it all the way to week 15, which is really saying something because there were 110,000 entries, and this week there's only 460 teams remaining. So technically, 1 in 460 chance of winning the contest at this point, if you want to do the simple math and not really account for like team strength or anything. The number one prize is $100,000. So it's kind of cool. This is what the team looks like. So I have Jaden Daniels, Justin Herbert, and Bryce Young. I have Saquon, Travis Etienne, James Conner, Rico Dowdle, Roshan Johnson, Jamar Chase, DK Metcalf, Terry McLaurin, Ladd McConkey, Jalen Polk, Adam Thielen, Demario Douglas, Malachi Corley, David Njoku, and Hunter Henry. All in all, I think it's a pretty sick team. Obviously, the Saquon and Barkley combo has been carrying me throughout the season. I'm hoping they'll keep carrying me this week. And I'm in a pod this week of 10 teams. 5 of those teams will advance to next week. Next, in week 16, it's the same deal. 5 out of 10 will make it through week 16, and then it's the finals. So I've got 2 50-50 shots, and then I'm in the finals. I'm competing for that grand prize. And I'm just kind of freaking out about it because I feel like I've never really gotten this close to something. I have a lot of teams that are in the best ball playoffs, but most of those teams, it's still a gauntlet to get to the end because it's like you have to be the top team, number 1 out of 10 this week and then number 1 out of 10 again next week. In this case, the finals feel so attainable and yet just very scary because the other teams that are left are very good as well. Obviously, really hoping that David Njoku can tough it out and play this week. That would be pretty huge for me. Hoping Saquon and Chase can get it done. Hoping DK Metcalf can have a good game for once in his life because I'm the only person in the pod that has DK Metcalf. Really hoping Ladd McConkey plays. Hoping Adam Thielen can keep doing what he's been doing. But, overall, really excited to see what this team can do. So if you're watching on Sunday and you see Jaden Daniels run for a touchdown or Rico Dowdle make a big play, just know that I will be fist pumping here at my desk. So anyway, just a little inside look at one of my situations. And again, hoping I can at least make the finals because there are plenty of prizes outside of that $100,000 that I would gladly take. If you make the finals, it's $500 at least, which is a pretty nice return on investment for a $10 entry. But if I can make top 50, top 25, something like that, it's still a pretty fun payout. So fingers crossed, should be fun. Let's talk some Dynasty at this point. Yeah, it's pretty sick. I'm excited. It's definitely got me hooked on this format where I'll definitely go back next year and draft way too many teams and none of them will do this well. I'm sure that's how it'll go. But looking here in the member stream channel, I asked for some questions. We'll just jump into these, run through them. I'll give my best possible answer. The first one from Schnitz asks, is there anything rebuilding teams should be doing while they aren't able to make trades until the offseason? I mean, my answer for that is really just touch some grass, I guess. This is your opportunity to have an excuse to not be super active and maybe genuinely put that time towards something else, draft some playoff best ball teams, go do something else fun, exploit your edge in different ways. But as far as what you can actually do with your teams, I mean, it's really, there's nothing you can do other than work the waiver wire, right? There's literally no other transactions. You can't, coach up your players and help them get better for next year. So you can look at the waiver wire, but honestly, at least in the leagues that I play, the waiver wire is really a wasteland right now. And I'll combine this with a question from Durham Dave that was asked a little further down. Are there any good end of season waiver stashes? I mean, it just depends on how deep your league is, I guess. My leagues, for the most part, you've got 25 roster spots or more. A lot of them push up towards 28 or 29. You add taxi squads in there too. There's just not a lot of players available. Anybody with a pulse is getting picked up pretty quickly. But I would say, in terms of players to be on the lookout for, anytime there's a running back that's on an active roster, that's a guy that's worth stashing when you have an empty spot because it doesn't take talent to even get on the field. It just takes injury. It just takes, Patrick Taylor was very close to starting a game for the San Francisco 49ers in which he probably would have scored double-digit PPR points. Those are the types of players that you want to stash. It certainly helps if those players are talented, but you look around the league, guys like Sincere McCormick, Alexander Madison, even Cam Akers to a degree, Isaiah Davis, these running backs that really weren't expected to be on the grid at all, finding their way into touches. I think that's really your best bet. And Isaiah Davis, if he is still out there in any of your leagues, which I tend to doubt, but if he is, he's a guy I would drop all of my remaining fab on. I would sell the farm for Isaiah Davis because he actually had a really good profile. JJ Zachariason was really high on him, and him going to the Jets, when they also took Braylon Allen, seemed like kind of a death knell for him, where he wasn't going to have any opportunity. But really impressive that he was able to split the work with Braylon Allen in that game. Breece Hall missed, actually looked better than Braylon at times. So he's a guy I would really be interested in holding, even through the offseason, and just seeing how that backup situation shakes out. Otherwise, not a ton of really specific targets. Again, it's going to vary depending on your league. I don't have data on how rostered some of these guys are, but that is what I'd be prioritizing. There aren't a lot of names at wide receiver that really come to mind for me, but I avoid the roster clogger types. You don't need to roster Tyler Boyd. You don't need to roster those types of guys. Somebody who's a rookie, year 2 player, someone that does actually run some routes. You can stash those guys. I actually think backup quarterbacks are overlooked in certain leagues. Somebody like a Marcus Mariota. Who are the other backups right now that are potentially available? Any backups that, especially ones that do have mobility, but guys like, shoot, I'm spacing on the names I was thinking of. Mariota is definitely a good one. Brandon Allen for the 49ers is a guy you can continue to stash, if you have space. Tyrod, yes, good call out from Yella. Tyrod Taylor, I went and picked him up in a few leagues, 1 or 2 weeks ago when it was said that Rodgers might not finish the season. So those are also cases where it doesn't take much for that player to get on the field. It's just one guy has to get injured. Jake Browning for the Bengals would be another one. So Sam Howell for the Seahawks, if someone's dropped him. He had some pretty big dynasty interest at one point. So that's what I would say. There's nobody right now that strikes me as an impressive or under the radar waiver target. Because anybody that's still on waivers at this point, pretty unlikely to have a lot of staying power heading into next season. It's really, you're just throwing darts at the dartboard. But there's no reason to have empty slots on your roster. You might as well be picking people up. And the people that I'm more interested in picking up would be the backup quarterbacks, would be the depth running backs. Austin Jenkins, good call on Carson Wentz. Jimmy G. Yeah, these are guys that you might as well hold because, you never know. I don't want any quarterbacks to suffer season-ending injuries. But if somebody suffers a significant injury right now, that could put next season in doubt too. And some of these guys can shuffle teams in the offseason, end up being starters when you don't even think they will be. Like Sam Darnold, I had stashed in a ton of leagues. Nobody was looking at Sam Darnold and thinking that's a week 1 starter. But in the end, he became a very valuable player going to a new situation. So it just makes sense. Big B, welcome to the club, new member. This is a weekly occurrence here. If you have a question at any point while I'm talking, just jump in. If it's a trade question, if it's a start sit question, even, I don't care. I'm not any kind of a start sit expert. I'll happily talk it out with you. There we go. You got a question already in right now, so you're ahead of me. What would you do with AJ Brown long term? Well, I know you joined off the back of my wide receiver tiers video, so you probably heard a little bit of my thoughts. I think he does have a bit of a limited ceiling due to the situation, at least a projectable ceiling. Things can always change. But in terms of what I see as the most likely situation for him heading into next year in the future, I don't think he has a top 5 wide receiver finish ceiling, or at least I don't think it's likely unless he runs super hot on touchdowns or something. But in terms of, what would I do with him long term? Probably trying to pivot into one of these other younger receivers. Somebody like Drake London, who I think in most leagues is still valued behind AJ Brown. So can you go and trade AJ Brown for Drake London and even get, an early second on top? Can you trade AJ Brown plus a couple of seconds and get Malik Neighbors? What can you add to AJ Brown to get Puka Nacua? Those are questions that I'd be asking. He's not somebody I'm worried about. I think he's going to continue to be kind of at least a fringe wide receiver one for multiple years. I think he's going to be pretty safe, but I think he could start to decrease in value year over year just at his age, 27, 28, 29. That's when you start to see kind of this little gradual decline. Like Terry McLaurin, he's having a career year right now at age 29. He's not going to gain that much startup ADP heading into next year because he'll be 30 years old when the season starts. And so that's why I just think it makes sense to try to pivot into those younger guys, even when the older players are performing pretty well. I'm seen as a threat in this particular league. So they know there's a shark in the water, and so they're treating you with caution. I've definitely experienced that in a few leagues. It sucks when people aren't confident enough in their own abilities that they feel like they have to like handicap certain managers, but you must be doing something right if that's the case. So probably just keep it up. Matt IMD asked, I know we buy injured players in their prime as a rebuilder, for example, Rice or possibly Brandon Ayuk. How are you handling Chris Godwin? I'm curious, both as a playoff team that never moved him before the deadline and as a rebuilding team in leagues where he's on the trade block. So I'll start with that. He had a second question as well. Yeah, he's absolutely right about buying injured players in their prime. Those guys are basically guaranteed to regain value as they start to return to the field. It's pretty well documented. It's pretty intuitive as well. Just makes logical sense that that's going to happen. You're paying essentially, or you're being paid when you trade that player later. You're being paid a tax for having held them that whole time. You're gaining something as it's like an investment, honestly. But with an older player like Chris Godwin, I don't think he's so old that I'm worried about it. I think people were trading him for like late second value when he first got hurt. At least in certain spots where they were desperate for another player. Now, people probably are holding for anything short of, let's say, mid-second, unless you can give them a useful player that they need for their playoff run, like a Cortland Sutton or something. And so I think people are going to be pretty eager to get back on the Chris Godwin train. What I've seen about his injury is that he should be good to go for next year. So if he returns to Tampa Bay, I don't think he's going to be like a 19 points per game guy like he was this year, but he should slide back into that mid wide receiver 2 production at least. I think that's a guy worth an early to mid second. That's how I have him ranked. And so not a player I'm super worried about, I guess I would say. If you still have him, I wouldn't be worried that you're carrying him into the offseason. There's really nothing bad that can happen to his value from now until you're able to trade him next. So that's what I would say. I do have him in 1 or 2 leagues. I've bought him in at least 1 league since he got hurt. So that would be my answer. Next, we have, let me just jump into this member question first from Austin. I had a trade question in with Garrett Wilson. He wants 2 late firsts for people playing each other this week. Would you do 1 late first in 2 seconds? The answer is yes, I would do 1 late first in 2 seconds. My follow-up would be, why does this dude feel like he can just jerk everybody around? I feel like you had a deal in place already twice, and he just keeps upping the ask. He's starting to kind of come across like a pretty annoying person to deal with. But yeah, I mean, you've got 2 people playing this week, so you know that one of them is going to be 107 or 108, and you know for a fact that one of them is going to be at least 109 or 110. I don't think you need to do that. I think it could be fair. I don't think it's unfair to trade 2 late firsts for Garrett Wilson, but it does feel like you can carry those picks into the offseason and potentially do something more interesting with them later. So I'm a definite yes on the late first in 2 seconds. I would say hold for now with the 2 firsts. All right, Mad Eye's second question was, as a player with 6 leagues, hungry for more, how many startups per offseason do you think is optimal, assuming purely game theory without financial restraints? Not sure if I'd want to add one per month, two per year, just go nuts, get closer to 20 leagues. Yeah, I don't have any kind of a game theory. I assume the thought would be, if there are edges to exploit in every off season, do you want to keep yourself open to doing more startups to potentially exploit those edges? And maybe so. I haven't gotten that far into it. Honestly, when I join leagues, it's just because I want to and I have a problem, and I love dynasty startups are like one of my absolute favorite things to do. So I've always just joined leagues based on my own desires. But I think the answer is to do those startups this season as opposed to future years. You know, if you have an edge that you can exploit, you might as well start exploiting it in more leagues sooner, right? And I think, you know, being plugged in, being a pure potential member, obviously, you should have a leg up over the average dynasty player. And so why not join? You know, why not be in 20 leagues? If you want to be in 20 leagues eventually, why not be in them sooner, potentially realize that profit sooner? So that's probably what I would say. As far as, you know, leave yourself open to do more startups in future years just because they're fun, but not for any kind of a strategy reason. If it was Drake London instead, would that change your mind? No, I mean, I have London one spot ahead of Wilson. I view them very, very closely. Would you rather 202 or 2 playoff seconds? It's very early. Like, it's too early for me to really say. I would lean the 2 playoff seconds right now, just based on what I've been hearing about the draft class and how it might pay better to have multiple shots in the second round as opposed to those early picks. But we really aren't going to know until we have some solid mock draft data. And if not that, you know, how we have actual NFL draft capital. It's just really, really hard to say. So probably for now, I'd rather have the 2 seconds, but that is definitely subject to change. Yellow says, I would suggest having some competing and some rebuilding. Yes. I wouldn't just rebuild some teams because you feel like you need some teams to rebuild. But most of the time, if you have a large portfolio of teams, you're probably going to end up having a couple that need to rebuild. But like last year, I was closer to like 60-40 contending. And then this year, I only had 2 teams heading into the year that were intentionally rebuilding. That ended up being a couple more once the season got underway and I had injuries or underperformers. But you can get to a point where the majority of your teams are competing. And I think that that's a good thing. Like that should be the goal. But it does make sense when you have a larger portfolio. When you have 30, like if you have 20 teams, right, you should feel much less pressure to take, let's say, 2 of those teams that are kind of on the edge and you feel like they probably don't have enough value to make it to compete and avoid a rebuild. You should feel more comfortable just saying, I'm going to tear these 2 down right now because I know that across my whole portfolio, I have enough competitive teams that I should still come out ahead. And these teams are going to be better off in the long run if I do this rebuild now. So in that sense, I do think you're usually going to be better off having a couple rebuilds. You're also, that way you naturally are getting exposure to those early round rookies or early first round rookies in each class. Some of those can be like franchise changing type of talents. You don't want to totally miss out on those across a huge portfolio of teams. Big B, this is an incredible move, trading the 206 and Jalen Coker for Josh Downs. That's awesome. I mean, that's a top 50 asset in Dynasty. So I don't see how it could be a bad move to get that type of a player for those pieces. Even if Jalen Coker is mildly interesting, I think he's definitely worth a stash. He's a guy that slipped my mind, but if he's not rostered in a Dynasty league at this point, he should be for sure. But yeah, that's a great deal. T-Hum says, my main league, I went into the year in that awful position of being a fringe team just to be the second seed and having a solid chance. You never know what can happen. I finished last year. Yes, this is 100% true. And that is why I typically try to ride it out into the season as far as I can. Like, you have to know the rest of your league and know, okay, is someone else already tanking? And, how many teams could potentially drop out and start tanking? But, like, if you can slow play it, if you can go 3-4 weeks into the year before you make that decision, you might end up surprising yourself and being able to go all the way. And especially if you have a team that starts out like 3-3 but you feel confident that you have the pieces, either because they're coming back from injuries or something is changing situationally, or you've scored a lot of points and just gotten unlucky. Yeah, it usually pays to ride it out and see what happens. I had a league exactly like that where I was 3-3. I actually made a video about it. It was the one where it was sort of figuring out whether you should rebuild. I went ahead and rode it out with that team. I also got the second seed, picked up a bye week, and end up looking pretty good heading into the semifinals. So I would always say, lean more into, let's see what this team can do. Maybe these guys are going to surprise me, as opposed to preemptively closing up shop and jumping into that tank and then not being able to undo it. All right. Chris isn't going to see this. He's one of the mods in the Discord, and he is a very good buddy of mine, but he's not a YouTube member because he knows he can get my advice for free. But he did ask, what's the best way to set lineups without worrying about the stress that comes with making the wrong decisions? And honestly, I'm not a miracle worker. I can only do so much. I don't have the answer to this question. I stress out about my lineups every week. I did see someone suggest finding a good website you like and just sticking to that. That is definitely the mature thing to do. I would certainly applaud anyone that is capable of trusting that. But Dynasty Daddy is one that has a good tool. I know Chris sometimes uses that one. But there are plenty of good start-sit tools out there. Honestly, for me, I try to just go with the sleeper projections as much as I can, but I do sometimes add my own ball knower takes at the same time. Like, sometimes sleeper just seems wrong to me. I have a league where I'm in a playoff matchup this week. I have Jalen Waddle in currently. He's projected for, I think, 9.5 half PPR points, but my opponent has Tank Dell and Josh Downs, who's questionable and facing the Broncos defense, and both of them are projected for double-digit half PPR points. In my mind, I see no reason why Waddle would be projected for fewer points than Dell and Downs based on their matchups, based on how they've scored over the last month. And so, yeah, I mean, sometimes I'm a little bit of I'll just take my own approach and say, I think these are wrong. But for the most part, trusting the projections is probably going to just get you at least do as well for you as painstakingly trying to make every decision for yourself without any solid resource behind it. I think probably having lots of leagues helps in a way, because you can't afford to waste a lot of time thinking about them, and so you just sort of have to be like, well, I'm gonna go with this guy, and whatever happens because I got to go set 15 other lineups. That actually does kind of help a little bit. All right. Oh, T Helmet also suggested, think about if you had to go against your team, who would you certainly not want to be rooting against, then start that player. Yeah, I mean, if you can get into that mindset psychologically, at the very least, you're making the decision that you can live with. Whether or not it's the right one remains to be seen, but making the decision that you can live with after the fact is pretty big part of it. All right. We also have a start sit kind of question from N. Casau, one of our potential breakout members. I'm not sure if he's currently watching, but he said he had to choose 2 running backs for this week between JT, Connor, Garendo, and Rashad White. And he's like, can you explain the decision process to choose who to start here? And then he brings up matchups, injury designation, game weather, teammate injury designations like Bucky Irving, performances thus far this season. So it is a complicated decision, and that's why I mostly try to look at projections, because they should be factoring in all of these things. They should be factoring in if a player has a bad matchup, at least, and if the player has been bad in recent games. Those should both be factored in. You can definitely argue at the margins about whether something like weather that's unclear would be factored in fully to a projection, or a teammate potentially being out versus in. that also would matter because the projection is probably going to take like a middle ground approach between those two outcomes. But for the most part, if I was making this decision between JT, Connor, Garendo, and Rachaad White, I would be thinking, first of all, with Garendo, I probably would have left Garendo on the bench, knowing that there was a weather issue and also knowing that he was playing with an injury. And I would just tell myself, look, I only need 2 running backs. I know that these other running backs are at least close. So why do I need to risk the one that's injured when I can play healthy running backs that I think are at least close to the same type of ceiling outcome as Garendo? So I would have left Garendo on the bench in that case. And then I would start to think about, do I need a ceiling outcome, right? Do I need a high ceiling outcome? Because it feels like Jonathan Taylor is the type of guy who can break off a really long run. He can get 2 touchdowns. I feel like he's the one I would say, like, I'm going to be kicking myself if I leave Jonathan Taylor on the bench and he goes off on my bench and costs me my matchup. So probably would lock in Jonathan Taylor. And then for me, probably going with James Conner over Rachaad White, just because I think Conner's the better player and we know he's locked into a larger share of the backfield than White. But at that point, you're talking about whichever one scores a touchdown is probably going to be the better starter. And I don't think you need to beat yourself up too much about that type of a decision. You have to just say, look, this is unknowable. There's no possible way to foresee which of these 2 guys is actually going to have the better game. So I'm going to go with the one that I want to go with. I'm going to go with the one who I would more enjoy rooting for, or the guy who's projected for more points, and just go with that. Let's see here. Okay, I think that's all the questions in Discord. So if you guys have other questions, again, feel free to drop them in. I'm going to just talk through some of the stuff that was on the Dynasty Points podcast. I did not listen all the way to the end yet, and I would definitely, again, push people to go check out Dynasty Points. It's not because they're a sponsor or not even affiliated anymore right now, but I just like what they do. I specifically like how Jacob Sanderson approaches the game. I definitely have made that known, but I think it's a good show. It's an entertaining show, and it's informative for sure. But they had Brett Whitefield on this past week, and he's very big into the college prospecting, has a very thorough evaluation process, and from what I have heard from him, really seems to know what he's talking about in terms of player talent. One of the things I found interesting from him is that he's really big on Shedeur Sanders. He thinks he's a very good prospect. He sees some similarities to Joe Burrow. Jacob compared him to Geno Smith in terms of how he operates a complex offense and is sort of able to make things work despite not having a very competent offensive line, not having a good running game, still being able to make all of these decisions at the line, find the right place to go with the ball, operate under pressure. And Brett seemed to agree with that. So those are favorable comparisons. And so that's super promising. Seems more and more likely that Sanders is going to go top 5. And so that's going to make him a real conversation in the 102, 103 area of rookie drafts, at least for Superflex, obviously. And so that's interesting. Now, the one caveat is that Sanders does not project to add much value as a rusher. So my expectation is that even with these favorable reports, even if it is true that he's probably a good quarterback or has a good chance to succeed, I'm more likely going to be either A, opting for like a Tet McMillan player if I have the choice, or trying to trade that pick, because I don't love betting on non-mobile quarterbacks to just succeed as passers, because their path to extreme upside is very, very thin. You look at Bryce Young starting to turn things around, but I made the same case about him last week, where I'm just not that worried about Bryce Young turning things around where I don't have any shares, because for him to become a pocket passing quarterback that really matters in fantasy, he's going to have to be Justin Herbert, Jordan Love, Joe Burrow caliber of player. It's just a very, very hard needle to thread. And so I'm probably going to let other people roll the dice on Sanders and hope that they hit it big with the next legendary star quarterback. And I'm probably going to be trading him for Dak Prescott plus, or trading him for Kyler Murray, or whoever he's valued across from, is probably how I'm going to be playing it. Yellow Dog, you are consistently too kind to me, saying that you now have too high expectations for other content. I do think that their content, while it's not as compact and information packed as mine, as a podcast, it's nicer long form content with good varying opinions, and I do think it's better to listen to other people, even if you do hold my opinion in high regard, which I absolutely appreciate and respect. And I think, I try to earn that, but I do think it's still good to hear other people's opinions. And so I always push people towards the Late Round Podcast, Dynasty Points, especially. And, those are the ones that come to mind. The other stuff I listen to is mostly best ball stuff, legendary upside, ship chasing, those kind of things, but they sometimes talk Dynasty as well. Another note from the pod, Tet McMillan from Arizona, clearly the wide receiver one in the class. That is consensus at this point, but they talked a little bit about some of his contested catch targets and how that's not a concern. They compared him to some cross between Mike Evans and Drake London, more of a twitchy athlete than Drake London, he said. Not quite as much of a freak as Mike Evans, but seems really promising for him to step in and succeed at all levels of the field. Can pretty much do anything, and really tall, athletically gifted wide receiver. Might have a 40-inch vertical, was clocked at 22 miles per hour on field last year. So just, he's going to come out as a very, very exciting wide receiver. I won't be surprised if he comes into the same tier immediately as like AJ Brown, Marvin Harrison, right out the jump. And he could go top 5. He could potentially go top 5 in the draft. They didn't get into specific names at tight end while I was watching, but Brett did point out that this is a really deep class at tight end, more so than it is at wide receiver. And there are a lot of good pass catching tight ends. So this could be an interesting year to have second round, third round picks where you can take some shots on some pass catching tight ends and potentially hit big. The thing I'm noticing about tight end lately more than ever is, outside of the elite talents at the position, it's mostly a function of what kind of system are you in? How much do they want to lean on the tight end? You look at Evan Ingram the last couple of years, I don't think he's supremely talented, but he's found himself in a situation where the team wants him to run a bunch of routes. They have had need of him to pepper him with targets. You look at some of these spike weeks we've seen from Cade Otton, that we've seen even from like Theo Johnson starting to break out. If there is opportunity for that tight end to become the second best target earner on the team, and the offense has a need or wants to build that in, that's going to matter more than potentially, someone like Sam Laporta, who we think is pretty talented, clearly not talented enough to just dictate the offense around him. So I do think it could be interesting to take shots on a lot of these tight ends and just sort of see what they are able to make of themselves in the offense that they land in. And then the last note about running backs, he did point out 2 other running backs that I had gotten to so far. These are his top 3, along with Ashton Janty. It's Caleb Johnson out of Iowa and Omarion Hampton out of UNC. These are guys to watch at running back, both guys that he thinks have at least an outside shot to sneak into that late first round, specifically Caleb Johnson, but also Hampton. And this would really be huge for those mid first round picks. If we were to get multiple first round running backs, or at least get them into the early second round, that's really going to add value to those mid first when you consider Shedeur Sanders, probably another quarterback like Cam Ward getting that high draft capital. You're going to have Travis Hunter in the mix. You're going to have Tet McMillan in the mix. So if you do have these running backs, it would kind of be reminiscent of the Travis Etienne draft class, where you have Etienne and Harris go in the first, and then you have Javonte Williams go in the early second, also out of UNC, just like Hampton. And those guys were all going in the top 8 or top 9 picks of the rookie drafts that year. So that's something we should be rooting for. Obviously, we want as many running backs going in the first 2 rounds as possible, but those seem like the big 3 right now. And it is going to be interesting to see where they go, because some teams just don't seem to value running backs. And so we could find ourselves in a situation where running backs go to the teams that we don't want them going to, teams that already have running backs, because they value the position and they want to build, multiple running backfield, like we saw with Carolina, bringing in Brooks with Hubbard, like we've seen with Detroit with Gibbs and Montgomery. Some teams are going to care about the position. Seattle with Walker and Charbonnet. Green Bay, didn't really work out with Marshawn Lloyd, but they went and drafted him in the 3rd round after bringing in Josh Jacobs. So you could see this happen, where the running backs go to teams that we don't necessarily want them to. Everybody's going to be wish casting Ashton Janty to Dallas at 12 or whatever they end up being. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think Dallas actually values the running back. I think people think they do because they took Ezekiel Elliott almost 10 years ago now. Everything they've done since then, late round picks on Pollard, late round pick on Dowdle, bring in Dalvin Cook for free, bring back washed Ezekiel Elliott. Like, they haven't made any other moves that suggest that they value running backs. They could have tried to make a splash signing in Derrick Henry or, I don't know, Austin Eckler or Josh Jacobs or whoever was a free agent. They didn't do that. So I do think they're pretty unlikely to go round 1 running back, maybe round 2. A round 2 running back to Dallas would absolutely be a huge smash in rookie drafts. But again, we can't cross our fingers that these teams that don't value the position are going to immediately start. But I'd say the last relevant point they made about running backs was just, if you do have guys that are kind of not fringe talents, but like not entrenched starters. So someone that comes to mind would be like, Brian Robinson, possibly, 3rd round talent or former 3rd round pick, has been good, but the team doesn't really have much behind him. They're not invested in him beyond his rookie contract. Those are guys that could be a little bit risky to be carrying into the offseason. And it depends what their value looks like in the offseason, but something where you might just rather have, an early second, if you can get it, than some of these running backs, because this is a very deep class, and you could easily see teams that don't need running backs grab an extra body in the 3rd round, the early 4th round, and all of a sudden there's conversations swirling about, is this a committee? Is this guy going to come in and steal work? We saw this with Trey Benson and James Conner. We saw this with Marshawn Lloyd and Josh Jacobs. Didn't end up meaning anything for Jacobs, but it did bring his value down a little bit. So that's something I'm going to have to think about more, which running backs in particular I'm worried about. Somebody like Isaiah Pacheco, I think, is maybe an underrated player in this regard, where former 7th round pick, doesn't have a long-term contract, dealt with this broken leg all offseason. We'll see how strongly he finishes the year in the playoffs, but there isn't a guarantee that he's going to get a long-term deal from the Chiefs. And so I think he's a good player. I think he's probably going to remain their starter. But are they going to bring in a different player and potentially use him in more of a committee, like they sort of did with Jerick McKinnon for a little while? I don't know. So probably not going to be the best offseason to be carrying a lot of value in those running backs that have kind of that early second price tag on them. All right. Oh, and as far as landing spots, interesting places, the Broncos in the back end of round 1 seem like an interesting spot. They clearly have not figured out the running back. You've got the Raiders are going to end up with an early 2nd round pick. I think they probably have too many needs to address to go running back, but that's going to be a wide open backfield unless Sincere McCormick ends up being the real deal. The Chargers towards the back end of round 1 as well. Really hard to see them trusting the health of J.K. Dobbins heading into next year. That's a guy I would definitely want to get out on for a second at this point if I can. They could invest in the running back. I think that they definitely value the run game. So that is something that I that I would be aware of. And I'm sure there are other spots as well, but those are some of the main ones that I would be considering. And they're all in the AFC West, interestingly. So there could be some real changes coming to that division as far as running backs. Yeah, so I'm excited to listen to the rest of that. Probably had another like half hour or so, and then we're gonna get into some of the later prospects. I'm excited to hear more about the wide receivers beyond just McMillan and Hunter. I don't know a whole lot about those guys. I know Luther Burden was a player that had a lot of hype at one point. I don't think he's quite lived up to that. So I'll be curious to see, if they view him as a first round guy still, or maybe a step behind that or not. Guys, now's the time. If you have more questions, haven't heard much lately other than Yellow Dog saying he still carries Jerick McKinnon because I guess his dynasty leagues are really, really deep. I do not think they're calling him back up. They've been riding with Samaje Perine and washed Kareem Hunt for about a month and a half now. I think it's probably over for Jerick McKinnon, but I respect the dedication. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off here. Appreciate you guys jumping in that were free. Anybody watching the replay, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for continuing to be a YouTube member. Love you guys. Appreciate your support. Let's have a great week, guys. Let's enjoy this quarterfinal week. Hopefully get a lot of teams through to the semis next week and just enjoy the end of the fantasy season. It's all chaotic. At this point, we've done all we can. It's out of our hands. Just got to trust our guys to come through. Should be a fun couple of weeks. So I will see you guys sometime next week. But as always, you can hit me up in the chat whenever you've got questions or just want to talk some ball. All right. Have a good one.